I was signing to establish a legal trust at the bank when my son walked in, grabbed my arm, shoved me to the floor, and said, "You're confused, old man. This ends today." I said nothing. I lay there for 11 seconds, then I smiled. He did not know that I had set a trap he never expected. Two men stepped forward from the crowd, quietly flashing their FBI credentials. His arrogant smirk vanished instantly as the cold steel handcuffs locked securely around his wrists. "This is Dad's Revenge Stories, and I'm deeply grateful you chose to be here. Tell me, what part of the world are you in right now?" Country City, leave it in the comments. Every answer makes this feel less like a video and more like a conversation. This story contains fictionalized elements included for storytelling and educational purposes. Characters and locations are fictional. The message, however, is worth holding on to. The floor of Millhaven Savings and Trust is cold Italian marble, the kind that holds sound the way stone holds cold, long after the source is gone. I know this because I spent 11 seconds lying on it. 9:28 on a Wednesday morning. I pulled open the heavy glass door, walked to the number dispenser near the entrance, and tore off ticket 47. The machine made a clean, mechanical click. I folded the slip into my breast pocket. The lobby was the way bank lobbies always are at that hour, fluorescent and unhurried. 6 teller windows ran the length of the far wall, 3 of them staffed by tellers who had already settled into the quiet rhythm of mid-morning. HD security cameras sat fixed at each upper corner, angled precisely to leave no inch of floor unaccounted for. Navy blue chairs in 2 rows down the center aisle. Marble floors that gave each footstep back to you slightly louder than the original, as though they were paying closer attention than anyone else in the room. I chose the 3rd chair from the left in the front row. Not the most comfortable seat, the cushion had gone flat, and the right armrest leaned outward, but it gave me a clean sightline to all 3 cameras and an unobstructed view of the entrance. 22 years of tracing money through institutions like this one had made the choice automatic. You sit where you can see what's recording and what's entering. You stop noticing you're making the decision at all. I opened the manila folder on my lap. Inside, documents prepared by Ellen Morrow of Morrow & Associates, elder law, 26 years in practice. The paperwork was for a living trust, a legal instrument that would formally place the Hargrove Orchard on County Road 7 under permanent protective terms. Once executed and filed, no one could transfer, encumber, or sell the orchard by acting in my name without my personally witnessed consent. It was the kind of quiet document that ends certain arguments before they can start. I reviewed the pages without reading them. I already knew every line. While I waited, I noted 2 things without looking directly at either of them. At window 3, a broad-shouldered man stood reading a deposit slip with the focused patience of someone with nowhere else to be. He was not a customer. He was a former county sheriff, 19 years on the job before he retired, and set up a private investigator's practice on the east side of Millhaven. His name was Calvin Reed. We had spent 2 decades on opposite sides of the same professional table. He enforced the law, while I built the cases that gave him something to enforce. I trusted him the way you can only trust someone after you've seen exactly how they behave when the situation becomes genuinely difficult and none of the comfortable options remain. Near the glass doors, a man in a gray jacket studied a home equity brochure with attention it didn't warrant. Joe Whitfield, retired fraud investigator, 20 years in financial crimes across the state. I had known him since 2003, since a case we didn't bring up in polite company. Neither man looked at me. That was exactly right. I watched the second hand on the wall clock above the teller windows complete 3 full, unhurried rotations before the main entrance doors swung open, pushed too hard for someone who wasn't in a hurry. 9:41. Nathan. Dark slacks, button-down shirt, a tie sitting slightly off-center in a way that said he had been moving fast before he got here. His jaw was set. His eyes crossed the length of the lobby and found me in under 2 seconds. and whatever composure he'd assembled on the drive over had already started to peel away at the edges. He crossed the marble floor quickly, keeping his voice flat and low. "Dad." He stopped just close enough to make it personal. "You need to leave. Right now. Whatever you think you're doing here." I did not look up from my folder. "I'm visiting my bank, Nathan. This is not how we handle things." The measured tone was thinning now. The particular erosion of a man who had managed a situation carefully, from a distance for 11 months, and was suddenly standing inside it with no margin left to work with. I closed the folder, set it on my lap, looked up at my son. "I'm sitting in a chair." He grabbed my left forearm. I pulled back, not dramatically, not urgently, exactly the way a man does when he knows precisely what he wants the other person to do next. Nathan's control broke. He shoved me sideways, a flat-palmed push against my shoulder, and I caught the edge of the transaction counter on the way down. Right elbow on marble first, left wrist folding wrong beneath me. The sound wasn't dramatic, just a body meeting stone. I lay still. The marble was cold through the back of my jacket. The fluorescent lights above were that particular institutional white that makes everyone in the room look slightly worse than they feel. I stared up at them and let three things settle into place. Eleanor's oak clock, the one hanging on Nathan's study wall, the one Nathan himself had helped me rehang in August, while I stood on the ladder, and he held it steady below. I thought about what that clock had been recording in the weeks since February. 47 seconds of audio. Calvin had played it for me 2 evenings ago, engine off front seat of his truck, parked behind the hardware store on Clement Street. Nathan's own voice, cold and precise. I will tell you what it said when we reach February. 11 months of breakfasts. 11 months of sitting across a kitchen table from a man who had already decided what to do with me, watching him watch me, giving him exactly what he needed to see, and choosing every single morning not to let him know I had reached my own decision just as clearly and considerably earlier than he had assumed. I let one slow breath out. Then I smiled. At the ceiling, at the cold marble beneath me, at the 11 seconds I had just spent lying in exactly the position I had planned to be in. The man from window 3 stepped out of line. The man near the entrance doors folded his brochure and straightened his jacket. 3 bank employees had their hands on their phones. Nathan stood over me, and for the first time in 11 months, his face showed me something he had not intended to show. It was too late for that now. A man doesn't smile when he hits a marble floor, not unless the floor is exactly where he planned to be. But to understand that smile, you'd need to go back 11 months. You'd need to start with a fire. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in January, which felt wrong. Somehow she had always been a woman of Sundays. I have tried in the time since to find a way to describe her without describing what she looked like, because her face changed over 31 years the way all faces do. But the things she did with her hands and her voice and her time stayed the same from the first year to the last. When she read, she tapped her fingernails lightly against the windowsill, 3 soft taps, a pause, 3 again, without appearing to know she was doing it. It happened with every book, every newspaper, every piece of mail that warranted more than a quick glance. If you pointed it out, she would look genuinely surprised, hold still for exactly 1 page, and then start again. She knew every apple variety in the orchard by name and by season, and she would correct you if you got one wrong. Never sharply, she would simply say the right name once clearly. The way a patient teacher makes a correction feel like additional information rather than a rebuke. Honeycrisp, Fuji, Cortland, Jonagold. She had planted the last row herself the spring before her diagnosis, because she said the orchard needed something younger coming in, or the whole operation would age out from under us. She said, "The important things go in the safe, Thomas." The way other people say goodnight, as a principle she had arrived at once, and never felt the need to revisit. The fireproof safe in the hallway closet was her idea, down to the model number and the bolt-to-wall installation, because she considered a freestanding safe an optimistic gesture rather than a genuine precaution. The orchard's legal structure was also her idea, and it was the most consequential one. She held 50% of the deed. I held the other 50. She had structured it as tenancy in common, a legal arrangement in which each owner holds a distinct independent share that can be inherited, but cannot be sold mortgaged, or transferred without the full written agreement of all parties involved. When she died, her 50% would pass jointly to Nathan and Connor. Any sale or encumbrance of the whole orchard would therefore require both sons to consent in writing before anything could proceed. Neither son acting alone, not even with my full cooperation, could complete a transaction without the other's signature. She told me why she'd done it one afternoon at the kitchen counter, over a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she talked. I want both boys to have to agree someday. That's how you keep a family talking to each other. She had the clause drafted by one attorney and reviewed by a second, and paid both invoices herself without mentioning either until the paperwork came back signed. January 14th, 2023. She was gone faster than the doctors had said to expect. I have looked for the right words for that specific morning and not found them, so I will let it sit as it was, a Tuesday, the kind of day that didn't suit what happened in it. For a long time after, Tuesdays felt off in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 31 years waking up next to the same person. 18 months passed. Connor called every Sunday from Seattle, reliable in the particular way of a younger son who suspects you are handling things less well than you let on and wants you to know he is paying attention. Nathan called monthly through the first winter, every 6 weeks through spring, and then without any pattern I could follow with confidence. I kept the orchard running with a hired crew of 3 men who knew the work and needed little direction. I could no longer manage the physical labor alone without consequences to my back, but selling was not something I considered. The trees were Eleanor's, and the yield didn't matter to me the way it once had. July 18th, 2024, 2:47 in the morning, I woke to smoke. Not the familiar accidental smell of something forgotten on the stove. This came from below, from the direction of the basement stairs, and carried a chemical edge underneath it. Not wood finding fire by accident. Something burning from a sustained and applied source. 2 decades of tracing money through fraudulent structures teaches you to recognize the difference between a thing that happened and a thing that was deliberately caused. I registered the difference in the first seconds of being awake. Then I moved. I did not think about the furniture. Not the photographs on the hallway wall, not the books on Eleanor's reading shelf, not the kitchen table we had driven to Route 11 to buy together in 1995 at a shop that has since closed. I went directly to the hallway closet and took out the fireproof safe. 85 seconds from waking to having the handle in both hands. 100 seconds from waking to the front door. Eleanor's principle applied in the one moment it was built for. I stood in the driveway in the warm July dark and held the safe against my ribs and watched orange light beat steadily through the windows of the house I had lived in for 31 years. The fire department arrived within 8 minutes. They worked the perimeter and controlled what they could, but the house was a wood frame structure from 1962. And old wood frame structures do not survive the kind of fire that starts in a basement at 3 in the morning. Nathan arrived 42 minutes after the first engine. He came alone. Vivian had stayed home, he said. His shirt was clean, not slept in, not grabbed in haste from a bedside chair. His eyes were clear and fully open, without the particular redness that stays with you for a good hour after someone pulls you from a deep sleep at an indecent hour. He walked toward the burning house with the settled, unhurried movement of someone for whom the scene was confirming something, rather than revealing it. Dad. He stopped beside me and looked at the house. Oh, God. Are you all right? The words were correct. The sequence was correct. They arrived one full beat later than they needed to. The house is gone, I said. Come home with us. Vivian already has the guest room ready. Before I had mentioned a hotel, before I had said anything at all beyond the fact of the house, I looked at the safe in my hands. Then I looked at my son, standing beside the burning house in a clean shirt at 3 a.m, with eyes that were not red. Okay, I said. It was the only word I had left. I told myself the feeling was grief and adrenaline, that I was reading shadows into a face because it was 3 a.m. and my home was burning. I am embarrassed now by how long I kept telling myself that. The first 2 weeks at Nathan's house felt almost warm. That should have been my first warning. The guest room had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that tells you more about intention than affection. A printed medication schedule sat on the nightstand, correct down to every dosage and time. An extra pillow had been added to the bed. The closet had been cleared to 3/4 full to give me room. Vivian's preparation was thorough and precise in the way of someone working from a checklist, not unkind, but without the small imprecisions that come naturally from actually knowing a person. I noted, without remarking on it, that she never once asked what I actually needed. She had already decided. The house offered its own kind of information. Nathan and Vivian's place was new construction, clean lines, open layout, the kind of modern design that photographs well and lives in carefully. A stack of unopened bills sat on the kitchen counter for 4 days before anyone cleared them. Vivian's car, visible from the guest room window each morning when she backed out for her shift, had a registration sticker 9 months expired. I noticed both without commenting on either, filing them the way I have always filed things that don't yet have a context until they do. Eleanor's oak clock was still packed inside the safe, wrapped in the dish towel I had used to cushion it the night of the fire. On the 3rd day, I unwrapped it and asked Nathan if we could hang it in the study. She'd want it somewhere people actually spend time, I said. Nathan agreed without hesitation, fetched the ladder from the garage himself, and held it steady at the base while I climbed and directed placement a centimeter left, then half a centimeter back, until the clock sat level and square on the wall above his desk. He held that ladder with both hands and watched me position his mother's clock directly above the place where he sat and worked each night. There is something worth noting in retrospect about a man who helps you hang a piece of evidence above his own desk. I have thought about that afternoon many times since. The address change form appeared in week 2, set beside my coffee cup on a Tuesday evening, with the low-key practicality Nathan had been applying to everything that month. Just so your mail routes correctly while you're getting settled, he said. It looked like a standard single-page form. I reviewed it and signed it without reading closely enough. I understood only later, considerably later, that the form contained more fields than any address change legitimately requires. There was a line for a social security number, partially pre-filled in Nathan's careful, unhurried handwriting, waiting for the last 4 digits I provided, without realizing I was doing so. That form was the first piece in a structure that took him 7 more months to finish building. Also in week 2, I opened my Sunday pill organizer and found that my lisinopril, a 10 milligram blood pressure tablet I had taken every morning for 7 years. A pill I had held in my palm enough times to know its exact weight and texture, had been replaced. The substitute was fractionally lighter. Its white was slightly less chalky. I held it up to the bathroom light for 4 full seconds and studied it. Then I flushed it. I retrieved my real medication from the interior lining of my travel bag, where a backup bottle has lived since my first year of fieldwork, because 2 decades in this profession teaches you to keep a backup of anything you genuinely cannot do without. I did not need a pharmacist to identify what had been done. A common supplement sized and colored to approximate a blood pressure tablet, available at any drugstore without a prescription. Not sophisticated. Sufficient for a plan that relied on a man who wasn't paying close attention. I said nothing to anyone. That same evening at dinner, Nathan asked about the weather forecast for the following week. I paused before answering, not long, 2 seconds. The kind of pause that belongs to a person whose attention has briefly gone somewhere else. Nathan noticed. I watched him notice it without appearing to look for it. The performance began in that kitchen at that quiet table at exactly that moment. It cost me nothing, except the sustained discipline of someone who has spent 22 years watching other people perform confusion for investigators and knows precisely what the genuine article looks like from the outside. Every Sunday after that substitute down the drain real pill from the travel bag, Nathan was watching for signs the change was taking effect. I gave him exactly what he was watching for. In the weeks that followed, Nathan asked natural questions about the orchard, the annual yield, the crew's schedule, what I imagined for the property's future. I answered each one directly. He was my son, and these were the reasonable questions of a son whose mother had loved those trees, and I had given him no reason yet to expect anything other than an honest answer. Thursday, September 5th, a thick envelope arrived from Hargrove Valley Development Group addressed to me. Nathan intercepted it at the front door, a habit that had formed quietly over the previous weeks, the mail always appearing pre-sorted on the kitchen counter by the time I saw it. He opened the envelope standing at the kitchen counter, while I sat in the adjacent room with a book open on my lap. I watched his back go completely still. It was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man receiving information that has just reordered everything he was planning to do next and in what sequence. He stood at that counter for 11 seconds. Then he folded the envelope shut, slid it into his jacket pocket, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. "Anything important?" I asked. "Just junk," he said without turning around. That evening at dinner, Nathan asked very quietly, the way a person asks a question they have been carrying for several hours, whether I had ever thought about selling the orchard. "A real offer," he said. "Something worth considering seriously." I told him the truth. Eleanor had left me her half under tenancy in common. I could not sell without Connor's written agreement, and even if I could, I would not want to. "Of course," Nathan said. "I was just curious." He reached across the table and refilled my water glass without being asked. I went to sleep that night believing it had been a good conversation. I didn't know that Nathan had already read a developer's number in that envelope, a figure large enough to permanently rearrange the priorities inside his head. Everything that came after grew from the moment he read it, and decided that I was an obstacle rather than a father. October brought the first frost, and something else, a change in the air of that house so gradual, I kept trying to explain it away as weather. My mail started arriving pre-opened. Not all of it, and not always, but enough to establish a pattern. A statement from the county auditor's office, a letter from the attorney still wrapping up Eleanor's estate, a piece of correspondence from the orchard keeper I'd hired forwarded from my old address. The first time it happened, Nathan explained without being asked. "I thought it was a utility bill. I didn't want you bothered." I accepted this. The second time, neither of us mentioned it. By the third, I had stopped expecting explanations and started paying close attention to what arrived and what didn't. The calls were subtler. I had a phone with 3 years of contacts in it and numbers I trusted, and I began trying to use it. I called Maggie Calloway, a woman I had worked alongside for the better part of 2 decades, a former chief investigator whose professional judgment I trusted without reservation. The call connected and routed cleanly and quickly to voicemail. I tried again the next morning. The same result. What I eventually understood was that Nathan had gone into my phone settings and configured all unrecognized incoming numbers to redirect silently to voicemail without ringing. A small administrative adjustment. Simple to make, difficult to notice, and precise in its effect, it severed contact from anyone who would need to call me directly, rather than go through the house. I confirmed it on a Thursday afternoon, during a short walk Nathan had been encouraging as good for recovery. I stopped at the house of a neighbor I had met once at the mailbox and asked to borrow their phone. Maggie answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful, unhurried, in the specific way of someone who has been watching for a call that never came. "You tried to leave a message 3 times, Thomas. Not one of them came through. That doesn't sound like a technical problem." I told her I was all right, that something had come up, that we would talk properly when I had more room to talk. We kept it to 90 seconds. I walked back at my regular pace before Nathan's car returned to the driveway. Connor had gone quiet, which I hadn't anticipated. When I finally reached him through a brief window while Nathan was out of the house, Connor told me that Nathan had sent him 2 messages in October. I was in the middle of physical therapy and preferred not to be disturbed during the recovery period. Connor had respected it. He was a considerate person by nature, the kind who doesn't push when someone asks for space, and he'd had no reason to question where the message had come from. He hadn't known to question it. In November, Nathan offered to take over my outstanding bills, just to simplify things while you're getting back on your feet. He used words like simplify and temporary words that sound like assistance and function, like a slow transfer of jurisdiction. He followed it 10 days later with a proposal to merge checking accounts. Just easier for everyone and only until things settled down. I said I would think about it. I had been saying that frequently and with great care. The power of attorney document appeared on a Sunday morning in November, set beside my coffee cup, while I was still reading the paper. Nathan placed it without ceremony. Just a legal formality. If something happened to you suddenly, it would make everything far easier for the family. A power of attorney is a legal instrument that grants another person full authority to make financial and legal decisions on your behalf without requiring your ongoing consent at each step. In the wrong hands, it renders a person legally voiceless in their own affairs. I understood this clearly. "I'll think about it," I said, not because I was genuinely considering it, but because a man who refuses cleanly and directly reveals that he knew precisely what was being asked of him. I was not yet ready to reveal that. 2 days later, Nathan became efficient instead of warm. He answered questions with the minimum number of words that could technically qualify as a response. He moved through the house with a purposefulness that left no space for incidental conversation. The temperature in that place had dropped, and it had nothing to do with the frost outside. One afternoon in the second week of November, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. Vivian was at the sink washing dishes, her back to me, in the automatic rhythm of someone doing a task that requires no thought. Then she turned not fully halfway, her hands still damp, her eyes finding me at the table. Something was forming in the set of her expression. Not distress, not accusation. Something earlier and quieter than both. The particular look of a person standing at the edge of a decision about whether to say something they have been carrying for some time. She opened her mouth slightly. From the hallway, Nathan's voice, easy, unhurried, the tone of a man simply looking for something. "Vivian, do you have those insurance forms I mentioned?" She turned back to the sink. Both her shoulders dropped a fraction, the small, specific settling of a person setting something down that they had almost picked up. She did not look at me again before she left the room. I sat for another moment after she was gone. Whatever had been about to happen had closed. I filed it the way I file things that I have witnessed, but cannot yet fully interpret carefully, and with the understanding that what doesn't make sense today sometimes explains everything 3 months later. That evening, Nathan allowed me 90 minutes to walk to the pharmacy and back. I chose the smallest spiral notebook on the rack. I paid $4 and change in cash. I put the receipt in the trash can inside the store and carried the notebook in my jacket pocket all the way home. Back in the guest room, door locked, I wrote the date in the upper right corner of the first page. Then I began. For 22 years I had built cases against people. Now I was inside one. The lock I checked on my bedroom door that night wasn't against intruders. It was against the part of me that wanted to walk down that hallway and confront my son before I had a single thing in hand that would actually stop him. By the first week of December, I had not spoken freely to either of the two people I trusted most in 7 weeks. That was not a coincidence. Nathan had been driving me to every pharmacy trip since October, casual about it. At first, just a son making sure his father didn't need to manage alone, and then a settled routine, and then a routine so established that neither of us named it anymore. He would wait in the car with his phone and drive back. I would collect what I needed and return within the agreed window. The arrangement had a practical surface to it, and I had never objected out loud. What I had been doing from the 3rd week was paying careful attention to what kind of calls he took while I was inside and how long they typically ran. On the morning of December 4th, his phone rang as we turned into the CVS parking lot. He glanced at the screen, held up one finger in my direction, and stayed behind the wheel. A client call, his voice settling into the measured, moderately warm register he used for that particular kind of conversation. He waved me toward the entrance. I got out and walked in. I went to the pharmacy counter first and collected my prescription from the pickup window. Then I walked to the electronics section at the far end of the store. A prepaid tablet sat on the bottom shelf between two more expensive models. Entry-level Wi-Fi and cellular capable in a modest box. I picked it up, carried it to a self-checkout register, and paid $37 in cash. I did not take a receipt. I slid the box inside my jacket against my ribs before I pushed through the automatic doors. Cash for anything you don't want attached to your name. 22 years of working financial cases in other people's jurisdictions teaches you that early and thoroughly. Nathan was still on the call when I got back to the car. He lifted his chin in acknowledgement. I sat down, fastened my seatbelt, and looked out the side window at the parking lot. He wrapped up the call 3 minutes later. We drove home without incident. In the guest room door locked, I sat on the edge of the bed with the tablet balanced on my knees. I connected it through a cellular network instead of Nathan's home Wi-Fi, another field habit. Because you use your own signal when you don't know who administers the network. I created an account under a name that was not mine from an email address that took 3 minutes to build, and placed a video call to Connor's number in Seattle. He answered after 2 rings. The relief on his face was immediate and genuine, visible even through the small screen. He leaned forward. "Dad, I've been..." He stopped, reset. "Are you all right?" I told him I was. I asked when Nathan had last been in contact. Connor said Nathan had messaged him twice since October, the first time to say I was in physical therapy and managing well. The second, to say I was still resting and preferred not to receive calls during the recovery stretch. Connor had waited it out. He was not the kind of person who pushes when he's been told someone needs space, and he'd had no reason then to question who had sent the message or whether its contents matched reality. He had been trying to think of an approach for 3 weeks. I laid out what I had in order without commentary. The mail arriving opened. The phone settings that routed unknown numbers to voicemail before they could ring. The neighbor's landline I'd had to use to reach Maggie. The address form with the partially pre-filled SSN field. The power of attorney proposal Nathan had placed beside my coffee on a Sunday morning in November. The temperature change in the house that arrived 2 days after I said I would think about it. Connor listened through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Then I'm flying down. I can be there tomorrow." "Not yet." I kept my voice low and level. "If you walk through that door before I've built something solid, Nathan closes every opening I have. I need time to assemble something he cannot explain his way around. Give me 2 months." A silence on the small screen. Connor's expression was the controlled stillness of a younger man who has just been asked to be patient about something that requires the opposite. 2 months, Dad, and then I'm in the car, whether you say so or not. 2 months, I said. I ended the call. I dialed Maggie without pausing. She answered before the second ring. We did not open with pleasantries. 22 years of working the same kinds of problems from different positions had settled that between us long ago. I gave her what I had: the address change form and the SSN field, the isolation pattern across mail and phone, and Connor the POA proposal, and the thick envelope from Hargrove Valley Development Group that Nathan had pocketed in early September and never mentioned again. Maggie asked 2 questions, both precise and operational. Then, "Give me your social security number. I'll pull your credit reports from all 3 federal bureaus: Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that is your legal right. I'll start there and work backward from whatever I find." I read her the number. She confirmed it said she would call when she had something, and ended the call without needing to wrap it up any further. That is what 22 years of working the same kinds of cases together sounds like. I sat for a moment after the line closed. Then I looked up. Vivian was standing in the doorway. She had not knocked. She was still in her nursing scrubs, a house key in one hand, which told me she had just come in from a shift and come upstairs directly. She had been there long enough. The tablet was visible on my knees, and the screen had not yet locked. She did not look alarmed. She looked at the tablet, then at me, the way a person looks at something. They are deciding how to categorize before committing to any response. She crossed to the nightstand, set a glass of water down without a word, and walked back out into the hall. Her footsteps moved toward the stairs and then down. Not toward Nathan's study, not toward his voice. I lay in the dark after she was gone and listened to the house. The specific creak of the 3rd floorboard outside Nathan's study door did not come. No voices from the floor below. No sound of her going back to the phone. Vivian had not asked about the tablet. Had not told Nathan, at least not that night. I lay there and found myself revising the picture I had assembled of her. Not Nathan's instrument exactly, but a person making choices inside that house that did not entirely serve his interests. I filed it the way I had spent 22 years filing things that didn't fit the first reading carefully, without forcing a conclusion before the evidence supported one. It was 11 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday night in January when I got up for water and saw the strip of light under Nathan's study door. I want to be precise about that detail, because in the version of this story where I look better, I woke up knowing something was wrong. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I woke up because I was 63 years old and couldn't sleep through the night consistently anymore, and I wanted water, and the house was dark, except for that one thin line of light at the far end of the hall. I stood in the doorway of my room and looked at it. Then the part of me that had spent 22 years training itself to notice things that other people walk past said very quietly, "Stop. Listen. Don't move yet." I moved down the hall, in the way I had learned to move in buildings, where I wasn't supposed to be heard close to the wall, avoiding the center of the floor, where old houses store their complaints. The light under the study door was thin and steady. The voice on the other side was low, deliberate, and entirely without the inflections a person uses when they think someone might overhear. I stopped at the door. The gap at the bottom was perhaps 3 centimeters. Enough. Nathan was on the phone with someone. He was not pacing. His voice stayed at the same distance from the door, throughout, which meant he was sitting, probably at the desk. Probably with his back to the door, which meant the gap gave me his words more clearly than he would have wanted to know. He's still refusing the power of attorney. I've tried every version of the ask. A pause, the specific silence of someone listening to a response. It doesn't matter. The Veld deal is already in motion. I have the deposit. 55,000 cleared. The authorization documents hold as long as he doesn't reach a specific kind of lawyer in the next 30 days. I did not move. I did not shift my weight. I did not let my hand drift to the wall. 22 years of building financial cases against people who did not know they were being documented teaches you that your own body is the most common source of interference. You go still. You let the room carry the sound to you, rather than leaning into it. The medical route is the backup track. Nathan's voice, unhurried and technical, the voice of a man who has rehearsed the structure of a plan until it stops feeling like one. Once we have the evaluation documented, Vivian is handling that side. It goes to the probate court as supporting evidence for a conservatorship petition. Under Ohio law, the court can appoint a guardian and grant them authority over financial decisions when the ward has been assessed as cognitively impaired. At that point, his signature on any transaction stops being a legal requirement. A brief silence. Then something that was not quite a laugh, short, low, without warmth or embarrassment, the sound of a person acknowledging something privately convenient. He thinks he's still sharp. He's a 63-year-old widower who fell apart once already when his wife died. We just need the right moments documented correctly. The voice stopped. The call was done, or at least that part of it was. I could hear the faint sound of Nathan shifting in his chair. I counted to 30. Not in my head, I moved through each number with the specific deliberateness I had used in hundreds of building searches over the years. Because men who are trained to count slowly under pressure count slowly even when their hands are telling them to move. At 30, I turned. I walked back toward my room along the outer edge of each step, where the wood sits closer to the structural beam beneath and doesn't carry enough flex to make a sound. A habit from a building search in 2009 that I had never stopped using. I reached my doorway and stepped inside. I sat down on the edge of the bed. My hands were completely still in my lap. The particular kind of still that I recognized from the worst moments in 22 years of difficult work. The moments when a case stops being professional and becomes personal. When the knowledge you've just acquired is no longer something you can hand off to a senior investigator or file through the proper channel and walk away from. When it is yours to carry forward, because there is no one above you to hand it to. I sat with that for a moment. Then I reached under the mattress where I keep the notebook when I am not writing in it, and I opened it to the next blank page. I wrote the date at the top, January 7th, 2025. Then the time 11:12 p.m. Then I wrote what I had heard in the order I had heard it in the plainest language I could manage, not interpretation, not analysis, just the words as they had come through the door. POA refused. Veld deposit 55,000 cleared. New line. Probate court. Conservatorship petition. Vivian medical documentation. New line. Evaluation to be filed as supporting evidence. Guardian appointed by judge. My signature no longer required. I read it back once. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. I cannot do this alone. I sat and looked at those 6 words for longer than I usually allow myself to look at difficult things. Then I closed the notebook and put it back where I keep it. 2 things were clear by the time I did that. First, Nathan had already committed acts serious enough to put him in front of a federal judge, wire fraud, identity theft through the credit accounts. And now, a conspiracy to fraudulently establish legal guardianship using fabricated medical documentation. Second, what I had heard through a door in the dark was not yet evidence. It was my account of a conversation heard through a gap at midnight by a man Nathan would spend considerable effort portraying as cognitively unreliable. I needed something that existed independent of my memory. Something recorded, fixed, verifiable, something that a court could play in a room while Nathan sat in it and had nothing to say. And I was going to need to build it with the patience that had made me good at this work, and the discipline not to confront a man before you are genuinely ready to finish the confrontation. Before I go any further, if you're still with me, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. Just the number. That's all I need to know you're here. A quick note. This story contains some fictionalized details shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. If that's not what you came for, This is a perfectly good moment to step away. No hard feelings. Nathan had been driving me to every errand since January casually, at first then, as an established habit, until neither of us called it anything anymore. The first genuinely free afternoon I had was a Thursday in February, when he had a two-property showing scheduled on the east side of town. I told him I would walk to the pharmacy. I walked 4 blocks past the pharmacy and sat in an old colleague's truck instead. Calvin Reed's truck was the same one he had driven for the better part of a decade, a gray-blue Ford with a dashboard that had collected several years' worth of coffee cups and a passenger seat that leaned slightly to the right because the track rail had been stiff since 2019 and he had decided long ago that it wasn't worth fixing. The heater worked well. The cab was warm and close and carried the particular smell of old coffee and a winter jacket that had dried over too many radiators across too many winters. He was parked with the front of the truck facing the alley exit and a clear, unobstructed view of the street in both directions. He had been positioning himself like that since before I met him. We had spent 2 decades on opposite sides of the same professional table. He enforced the law, while I built the financial cases that gave him something to enforce. That kind of working history produces a specific kind of trust. Not the trust of people who know each other's preferences and moods, but the trust of people who have watched each other under pressure and found nothing in the observation that required revising. We did not need much opening. He did not ask how I was doing. I told him what I had. I told it in the order it had happened, without commentary or interpretation. The address form with the partially pre-filled SSN field. The phone settings rerouting unknown callers to voicemail. The mail arriving opened the POA document placed beside my coffee cup on a Sunday morning in November. The change in Nathan's manner the 2 days after I deferred. Then, the hallway, at 11 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday night in January, the light under the study door, the voice through the gap, and everything Nathan had said. I recited it word for word, from the $55,000 deposit to the conservatorship petition, to the phrase, "Vivian is handling that side." Calvin listened the way he had always listened in the field, without notes, without interruption, without the small head nods that tell a witness they are being believed rather than being heard. Just complete professional stillness. 12 minutes. When I finished, he was quiet for 6 seconds. I counted. After 20 years of working near this man, I knew what his silences meant and what they were measuring. 3 simultaneous federal crimes, he said. Identity-based financial fraud on the credit accounts, and I will bet there are already accounts open in your name you haven't seen. Real estate fraud on the Orchard transaction. The POA he's presenting to that investor is unauthorized, and he knows it. And conservatorship fraud, using fabricated medical evidence to manipulate a probate court. Any one of those alone lands hard. All 3 documented together is the kind of case file a federal judge reads very carefully and doesn't put down. Sharon, I don't want to judge yet, I said. I need something that no one in that courtroom can dismiss as a confused old man misinterpreting a midnight hallway conversation through a closed door. Calvin looked at me for a moment, in the way he always looked at a problem when he was already past the problem and thinking about the solution. Then he asked about Nathan's working space, specifically whether Nathan used any one room consistently and at what hours. I told him about the study. Nathan worked there most evenings, often past 9 with the door closed. Calvin asked whether there was anything in that room I had placed there myself. Something of mine in his space before any of this began. I thought of the clock before he finished the sentence. Eleanor's oak clock. I asked Nathan to hang it in the study when I moved in last August. She would have wanted it somewhere people actually spent time. Calvin nodded once. I know a watchmaker on 5th Street, former colleague, runs a legitimate repair shop. If you brought the clock in for servicing, we could have it ready within 2 days. He paused in the specific way he pauses before stating something he has already thought through completely. Ohio operates under one-party consent for recordings under state law. Any participant in a conversation can legally record it without the other party's knowledge or agreement. As a resident of that household, you qualify. But I want to be honest with you about the primary purpose. If Nathan's voice ends up in a courtroom on disputed audio, his attorney will spend months contesting the context. If a woman who lived in that house comes forward voluntarily, on her own terms, with her own account of what she witnessed, that is a fundamentally different quality of testimony. The recording is for her. It gives her something fixed and verifiable that she cannot tell herself she misunderstood. I understood. The clock was not built for a judge. It was built for the moment when Vivian could no longer maintain the distance between what she had been told and what she actually knew. 4 seconds of quiet in the truck cab. I thought about Eleanor wrapping that clock in a dish towel before every move we made over 30 years, because she said that some objects were worth the inconvenience of handling carefully. I thought about how she had never used the word careful as a sentiment. She had always meant it as a specific instruction about what to do with your hands. She would have used every tool available, I said. It's what she always told me. We worked through the rest the way two people work through things when they have done this kind of planning before, and know that speed is the least valuable part. Maggie would continue the financial investigation, credit report, analysis, account, trail, documentation, anything recoverable through official federal records. Calvin would handle the clock and manage the recording equipment through the watchmaker. Joe Whitfield, a retired fraud investigator I had worked alongside intermittently for 2 decades, a man with a specific institutional knowledge of how financial crimes are constructed and disguised, would be available for the final stage. Calvin would bring him up to speed. I checked the time and told Calvin I needed to start back. Nathan's showing had been scheduled for 2 hours, and I had spent 40 minutes of my walk already. We did not make any formal gesture of agreement. Men who have spent 20 years working the same kinds of problems don't need to mark the moment twice. I walked back along the same 4 blocks at the same pace I had used going out. I turned into Nathan's driveway 12 minutes before he returned. The study light was already on. Nathan's silhouette showed through the gap in the curtains, seated at the desk, leaning slightly forward, the posture of a man working on something he considered important. And on the wall behind him, in the fading light of the February afternoon, Eleanor's clock. I hadn't yet worked out that what Nathan would say in that room in the weeks after February would be worse than anything I had heard through the door in January. I found that out on a Thursday in May, 4 days after sitting in Calvin's truck on a Monday morning, when Nathan hadn't looked up from his phone yet and Vivian had already left for the hospital. I mentioned the clock. Not as a request. I said it the way Eleanor used to raise things she had already decided as an observation that carried its own implication without requiring an immediate response from anyone. The chime had a slight delay to it, I said. Half a second behind where it should land. The kind of thing a person who didn't know the clock well would never notice. But the clock had been in our house since 1993, and I had heard its chime correctly 10,000 times. Eleanor would have hated it running wrong. I said this into my coffee cup, in the same tone I might use to say it was cold outside or the newspaper had been late. Something small released into the kitchen without expectation. Nathan did not look up from his phone. Sure, Dad. Get it serviced. The 5 words of a man who has no idea yet why that particular piece of information is going to matter. I took the clock down from the wall myself. I reached both hands up and settled them around the case the way you hold something that belonged to someone you miss, not because the object is fragile, but because the care is the point, and the point has nothing to do with the object. Eleanor had wrapped this clock herself before every move we ever made. She had said once that some things deserved to be handled as though they would not be coming back. I carried it out to the car, set it on the passenger seat with the face up, and drove to 5th Street without stopping. Millhaven Fine Timepieces occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a vacant insurance office. The front window was clean and simply dressed 2 pocket watches on velvet stands, a handwritten card about battery replacement. The bell above the door was the old-fashioned mechanical kind, attached to a lever arm with a sound that belonged to a previous century. There was a man at the front counter working on a wristwatch movement through a loop, and he did not look up when I came in. Real work. A real shop. In the same location, long enough for the floor to have worn shallow grooves in front of the counter. The kind of business run by someone who learned the trade from someone else who learned it properly. Calvin came out from the back. He had what he needed laid out on the workbench, in a way that to anyone not looking for it resembled a standard timing and adjustment kit. The camera unit itself was smaller than I had expected, roughly the diameter of a coat button matte black, designed to sit recessed in the cavity behind the decorative backing plate of the clock's chime housing. From the front face of the clock, it was invisible. From any angle available to a person standing at a desk in that room, it did not exist. It ran on an internal battery rated at 72 hours of continuous operation and transmitted a compressed, encrypted signal to a receiver unit Calvin kept inside his vehicle during his passes near the house each evening. He showed me the position it would occupy, the angle of its coverage field from that position, and the width of Nathan's desk at the expected capture distance. He was precise and unhurried in the way of someone who had done this kind of installation before, and considered precision a professional obligation rather than an extra step. You already have legal standing under Ohio's one-party consent statute, Calvin said, fitting the backing plate back into position with a thin tool. But I want to say what I said Thursday again, because it matters. What we're building here is not primarily for a courtroom. It's for the person in that house who needs to hear something she cannot reinterpret. When she comes forward voluntarily in her own words, on her own terms, that is a different category of evidence from audio. A defense attorney can spend 6 months contextualizing. He set the clock down and looked at me. The recording is for Vivian. I drove home with the clock on the passenger seat face up the same way it had arrived. Nathan was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the counter with his phone in one hand, reading something that required attention. He registered my return without fully looking up. Did they get it working? Ready to go back up, I said. He set his phone down on the counter. Want me to hold the ladder? It was a reasonable offer. It was in fact exactly the offer I had set up 4 days earlier when I planted the idea with Calvin, because I had established the precedent in August. The first time we hung the clock together, and Nathan was simply repeating a pattern we had already made. Patterns are how people move efficiently through days they believe they understand. That would be good, I said. Thank you. I positioned the ladder. Nathan took the base in both hands and braced it the same stance he had used in August, easy and practical, a son helping with a task that needed 2 people. I climbed with the clock under one arm, found the hook on the wall and seated it. Then I adjusted the position 2 millimeters to the left, the way Eleanor had always wanted it, stepped back on the ladder to evaluate and stepped down. How does that look? Nathan glanced at it for perhaps 1 second. Perfect, he said. Just like it always was. He picked up his phone and went back to whatever he had been reading. I stood in the doorway of the study for a moment and looked at the clock on the wall above his desk. Ticking correctly now, half-second delay resolved, positioned exactly where Eleanor had decided it belonged. Then I went to make tea. That evening, the clock began doing what we had built it to do. Calvin made his first pass at 9:45, parked half a block south for 17 minutes, and then moved to an alternate position 3 streets over. He would rotate his positions on a schedule that varied in timing and location. Different streets, different intervals, nothing that could resolve into a recognizable pattern from a window over time. He had done surveillance work long enough to understand that the thing that gets you noticed is never the single instance. It is the repetition. I continued the performance. At dinner that Tuesday, I paused a beat too long before answering a question about the week's schedule. A small hesitation, the kind that belongs to a man whose attention keeps drifting to a place it can't quite reach. I watched Nathan's eyes move to me, and then away in the brief, practiced assessment he had been running since September. I gave him just enough to confirm what he already believed, enough to sustain his narrative, not enough by a significant margin to be real. What the role cost me was something I hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite name at the time. Every morning I sat across the table from Nathan and allowed him to believe the confusion was genuine. I gave up something small that I could not reclaim at the end of the day the way you reclaim sleep. The clock is listening, I told myself each night after I locked my room. And what a man says when he believes he is the only clear mind in the room is almost always the most truthful thing you will ever hear from him. By the second week of February, Maggie had been working the financial trail for 3 weeks. When she called on a Monday evening, I locked the guest room door and sat on the floor with the tablet balanced on my knees. She was not one for preamble when she had something. 22 years of working the same kinds of problems from different positions had settled that between us early, and it had never needed revisiting. She opened by putting a document on the screen, a screenshot of the first line item she had found, the one that told her everything about the method even before she understood the full scale of it. She first national platinum, she said. Opened August 12, 2024. Account holder Thomas R. Hargrove. She gave me a moment to look at the date. August 12th, 2024, 6 weeks after I had moved into Nathan's house. Authorized contact on the account Nathan Hargrove. Outstanding balance $22,000, and you have no memory of opening this account. It was not a question. I confirmed it anyway. The Social Security number used to open it matches the one you gave me, she said, which is the one on the address form you signed in week 2. He used the partial pre-fill you completed to establish a credit identity in your name. Once the first account was open and aging in good standing, the remaining accounts were straightforward to build. By the end of February, 10 days of additional work on Maggie's part. Running queries through federal record systems she had used for decades. There were 9 credit cards and 5 personal loans, carrying a combined outstanding balance of $148,000. Nathan was listed as the authorized contact on every account. Maggie had located 17 documents bearing what appeared to be my signature account applications, authorization letters, consent forms for limit increases. She had sent 3 of the signatures to a forensic document examiner she had used in a federal case 12 years earlier, a woman now in private practice whose assessments had held up in court more times than Maggie could count. The examiner's response was measured and specific. The signatures were close, skilled work, consistent in pen pressure and baseline angle made by someone who had clearly studied the original carefully and over time. But not close enough for a federal proceeding. There were inconsistencies in the terminal strokes, the exact pressure footprint at the end of each letter that would not survive a qualified examiner under oath. I sat with the total for a moment. $148,000 accumulated under my name in my name, using 4 digits I had written on a form at a kitchen table because my son had handed it to me. I am not a man who makes a habit of thinking about money in personal terms, but I am 63 years old, and I understood what that number represented when I converted it into years. It was a particular kind of arithmetic that does not need to be said out loud to be fully felt. Where did the money go? I asked. Maggie had run the outflow analysis across 4 months. The majority of the funds transferred from the credit accounts had moved to a private real estate investment vehicle, a closed fund that had ceased operating 3 years earlier. She had confirmed Nathan's name in the investor registry from the fund's final reporting period. He had placed capital into it. The fund had failed. He had lost what he put in. The transfers from the fraudulent accounts were not enrichment. They were reconstruction money moved into a vessel that had already sunk, because allowing the loss to surface in visible places meant answering questions Nathan could not afford to answer. The remainder of the outflows, a recurring pattern she had traced across the same 4-month window, were payments to a private account she described as consistent with a creditor outside the formal banking system, not an institution. The kind of arrangement that accepts money without generating documentation that travels through standard channels. He is not spending this on himself, Maggie said. He's making it disappear in very specific directions. Someone is being kept quiet, Thomas. Whatever they know, it has been worth paying for across months. She stopped. Then, he used the form you signed in week 2 to get the last 4 digits he needed. Everything he built came from that one field on one page. But I want to say this clearly. The money is not going somewhere comfortable. The pattern is not a man enjoying access to other people's funds. It is a man trying to prevent a specific outcome from becoming visible. He is running out of ways to prevent it. I closed the tablet after the call and sat in the dark for several minutes. Then I went down for dinner. Nathan was already at the table. He waited until the meal had settled, until the easy, quiet rhythms of the table had been established, and then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had spoken informally with a medical colleague recently about memory. A few observations he had been keeping to himself for a while, things he hadn't wanted to raise until he had something more concrete. He thought a formal evaluation might be worth considering, just to have a baseline on record. For everyone's peace of mind. I feel fine, Nathan, I said. Of course you do, he said. He said it with genuine warmth, a son's patience, nothing in his voice that could be called unkind. But that's often how it presents in the early stages. He picked up his fork and continued eating, and the subject moved on in the natural way of a subject that had made its point without needing to be pressed. Vivian had looked down at her plate the moment Nathan began speaking. She moved a piece of food from one side of it to the other carefully and did not lift her eyes again during the exchange. Back in the guest room, door-locked notebook open. I wrote 2 things. The first was the structure 2 tracks operating simultaneously, converging toward the same legal outcome. The debt accumulated under my name established a record of financial incompetence. The argument that I could not manage my own affairs, that my financial decisions required supervised oversight. The medical evaluation Nathan had just announced he was pursuing would establish a record of cognitive decline, the argument that my own testimony and expressed wishes were not reliable. Neither track alone was decisive in a probate court. Combined and filed together as supporting evidence, they produced a conservatorship, ruling a judicial determination that my ability to contest any document, any transaction, any transfer bearing my name was no longer a legal requirement Nathan needed to satisfy. He needed both tracks complete. He was very nearly there. The second thing I wrote was one line at the bottom of the page below everything else. He is very close. What I didn't know yet was how far along the medical track had already traveled, whether Nathan was still assembling it, or whether something had already been documented and passed to someone in a position to act on it. That answer came on a Wednesday morning in March, set beside my coffee cup on the kitchen table. It was a Wednesday morning in early March. Gray light through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee already made by someone who had been up before me when I came downstairs and found a manila folder sitting at my place at the table. Not on the counter, not beside the fruit bowl. At my place, oriented toward my chair, with the same precise intentionality of the power of attorney document Nathan had placed beside my coffee cup 4 months earlier on a Sunday morning. Someone had wanted me to find this the moment I sat down. I opened it. The header read, Cognitive Assessment, Thomas R. Hargrove. Evaluating physician Dr. Raymond Goss, M.D. Neurology, Hargrove Valley General Hospital. 11 pages, including cover sheet, assessment narrative, standardized test results, and a single-page recommendation. I read it the way I had been trained to read unfamiliar documents, starting with the header information and working systematically through the body before allowing any response to form. My face, I hoped, was the face of a man reading something that was only mildly interesting. The clinical language was fluent and technically appropriate, which told me it had been prepared by someone who either had medical training or had spent considerable time reading similar documents. The core finding appeared on page 4, early indicators consistent with vascular cognitive impairment, most notably in domains of sequential financial reasoning and short-term working memory retention. The recommendation followed on page 9, supervised decision-making protocol for major asset transactions, pending follow-up evaluation at 6-month interval. The date of the assessment was listed as February 24th, 2025. I knew that date. On February 24th, I had been in Nathan's house from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, at which point Nathan had driven me to the pharmacy on Clement Street for a prescription pickup. The pharmacy printed a time-stamped receipt. I had kept it, as I kept all paper receipts from permitted errands inside the notebook's back cover. A neurological evaluation at Hargrove Valley General Hospital, a facility located on the other side of the city, does not happen between 4 and 5 in the afternoon as an incidental stop on the way home from a pharmacy. It does not happen in under an hour. It does not happen without the patient's active participation. February 24th was a day I could account for in detail with documentation. I turned back to the first page and looked at the hospital letterhead more carefully. The font weight of the institution's name was slightly inconsistent, heavier in some characters than in others, in a way that suggested a digital recreation rather than an original printed template. I noted this without changing my expression or the pace at which I was turning pages. Nathan came in from the hallway and refilled his coffee. He sat across from me. "What do you think?" he asked after I had reached the final page. I told him I would want my own physician to review it first. I said it without urgency, in the same tone I had used to say I would think about the power of attorney. Measured. Cooperative in register. Nothing definitive in content. Something shifted at the corner of Nathan's mouth. Not a flinch, not a grimace, but the micro-movement of a man who has just recalculated something and is adjusting his next position before it shows. He reached across the table and picked up the folder. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." He left the kitchen with the folder under his arm. I remained at the table with my coffee until I heard him go into the hallway bathroom. Then I stood up. The folder was on the kitchen counter, where Nathan had set it before going in. I walked past it to the far cabinet, opened it, took down a glass, and as I turned back, I caught the corner of the folder as it sat open on the counter, the cover sheet facing up. In the lower right, I read a line I had not seen at the table. I read it twice. Patient observation, record, clinical witness. Hargrove RN. I took my glass of water and went back to my chair and processed what that line meant. Vivian had not evaluated me. A nurse does not evaluate neurological function. That requires a licensed physician or clinical neuropsychologist with specific credentialing. What Vivian had done, according to the document's own language, was serve as a clinical witness to a patient observation record, meaning she had signed a statement attesting to behavioral incidents that Nathan had described to the evaluating physician as evidence of cognitive decline. Her role was to corroborate through her professional signature as a registered nurse a set of observations presented to her by her husband. The question was whether she had generated those observations herself from what she had actually witnessed, or whether Nathan had described them to her and she had signed. Those were two entirely different things. One was a nurse reporting what she saw. The other was a professional co-signing a story. Nathan came back into the kitchen. I was in my chair, drinking my water, looking at nothing in particular. He picked up his keys and said he had a morning appointment across town. I told him to drive safe. He left. I went directly to the study. The folder was still on the counter. I photographed every page with the prepaid tablet cover sheet, assessment, narrative, test results, recommendation, and the observation record with Vivian's signature holding each page flat against the counter surface and keeping the tablet level. 11 images. I sent them to Maggie and Calvin through the encrypted channel Calvin had set up in January. Then I put the tablet away and went back downstairs. In the notebook under the date, I wrote one question in the margin. V. Hargrove. Did she witness these incidents herself, or did Nathan describe them to her? And she signed. I sat with that question for the rest of the morning. There is a significant difference between a woman who helps build a trap and a woman who holds the door because she trusts the man who told her it is for her father-in-law's own protection. I did not know yet which one Vivian was. What I did know was that Dr. Raymond Goss had evaluated me on a day I could account for in complete detail, and I intended to find out whether he existed at all. Maggie began with the State Medical Board's online licensing registry on a Tuesday afternoon. She called me 4 hours later, and I could hear in her voice the particular quiet of someone who has just confirmed the worst version of something they had been hoping was not true. She told me what she had found in the order she had found it, which was the only way Maggie ever reported anything. She had started with Hargrove Valley General's publicly maintained staff directory, which the hospital updates quarterly and posts on its network site. No Raymond Goss? Not on the neurology service? Not on the consulting staff? Not in any listed credential category. She had then accessed 4 years of the hospital's historical personnel registries, which are available through the State Health System's Disclosure Archive. Still no Raymond Goss, not in full-time practice, not in an adjunct or visiting capacity, not in any year with available records. I ran the State Medical Licensing Board next, she said. The database is searchable by name, specialty, and licensure status. I ran Raymond Goss 4 different ways. No active license. No expired or lapsed license. No record of a disciplinary removal that might explain the absence. No name close enough to suggest a transcription error in the original document. She let a moment pass. He does not appear to exist as a licensed physician in this state. Based on what I have checked, he may not exist as a licensed physician anywhere. I had not yet said anything, she continued. The hospital letterhead on the assessment, the full institutional header Nathan had used to generate the document, bore the name and seal of Hargrove Valley General Hospital in the form it had used. Prior to 2022, in 2022, the institution completed a merger with a regional health network and formally rebranded, retiring the previous name logo and all associated stationery as part of the consolidation. Official documents issued after that point carried the new identity exclusively. The pre-merger letterhead existed only on archived stationery, the kind kept in old supply closets, or reconstructed from a scanned copy of an earlier document. The barcode format in the lower margin of the assessment was a reference protocol the hospital had stopped using in late 2021. The institutional seal was accurate to the old form, with a font weight that matched pre-merger print specifications and differed in a measurable way from anything the hospital's current administrative systems would generate. The document was not produced by Hargrove Valley General Hospital, Maggie said. It was constructed to closely resemble one. Someone spent time on it, but not enough time on the details that a person who knew where to look would check first. Then, Thomas. I ran the probate court's public case index this morning. Nathan filed a petition for conservatorship of your person and estate 3 weeks ago. You are the named subject. The fabricated cognitive assessment is listed as Exhibit A in the supporting documentation. There is a preliminary hearing on the court's calendar 6 weeks from now. I sat on the floor of the guest room with the tablet on my knees and looked at the opposite wall. I have worked with documents describing harm for the entirety of my professional life. Financial fraud cases are almost always retrospective work. The damage has been done, and your function is to trace the what and the how and the where the money went. This was something entirely different. What Maggie had just described was not a plan in progress. It was a completed legal filing processed through an official channel, assigned a case number by a court clerk, and placed on a judge's calendar. If I failed to appear at that preliminary hearing with legitimate legal representation and competent documentation, the petition would be adjudicated without meaningful opposition. Maggie, Ellen Morrow, she had called Morrow and Associates 2 days earlier. Ellen Morrow, 26 years in elder law, the attorney who had drafted Eleanor's living trust and reviewed the tenancy and common structure for the orchard deed, had time available. Maggie had made the appointment under her own name, in the event Nathan was monitoring my incoming communications in any form. The appointment was April 14th. "It's good," I said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "When the fire insurance report comes through whenever Hargrove County releases it, I want you to look at it immediately, before you put it aside for anything else." "What exactly are you expecting?" "I'm not expecting anything specific. I'm saying don't treat it as routine when it arrives. There are questions about that fire that haven't been asked in the right places yet." I said nothing further on the matter, because I had nothing more specific to say. What I had was the knowledge accumulated by a man who has spent 2 decades tracing money and knows that basement fires at 3 in the morning in old wood frame houses have origin points, and that insurance investigations ask the same questions investigators ask, working from a different direction, and with subpoena authority I did not have. The call ended. I sat for a while. Then I went down for dinner. I have limited memory of the specific conversation that evening. I was operating at the level of controlled functioning I had reserved in my working years for the most demanding days of a difficult case, the kind of day where the quality of your performance in ordinary moments is the only meaningful variable you can still manage. Nathan was at the table. I ate. When he asked how I was feeling, I said tired, probably the weather changing. He said spring always required some adjustment. I agreed with him and asked if he wanted the salt. On April 14th, I walked into the offices of Morrow and Associates. The waiting room was practical: 2 chairs, a low table, 2 small potted plants on the windowsill that had clearly been tended by someone who meant to keep them alive. Ellen Morrow came to the door herself and shook my hand once. She was a woman of measured vocabulary and precise physical movement, and she indicated the chair across from her desk without any unnecessary opening. I gave her the complete file. The address form with the SSN field. Maggie's credit report findings: 9 accounts, 5 loans, 17 forged signature documents. The forensic examiner's analysis of the terminal stroke inconsistencies. The encrypted audio recordings from Calvin's receiver, 22 days of material from the study reviewed and time-stamped, with the clearest exchanges annotated. The fabricated cognitive assessment with the pre-merger letterhead. The probate court filing she had already independently pulled. She read the core materials in 15 minutes, without asking me to explain anything, making margin notes in a hand too small for me to read from across the desk. Then she drafted a motion to continue a formal petition to the probate court, requesting postponement of the scheduled preliminary hearing on 2 grounds: that the named subject required adequate statutory time to prepare a properly documented legal response, and that the primary evidentiary exhibit in the petition was under active investigation for authenticity and could not be properly evaluated or answered within the existing schedule. The motion cited 3 specific procedural irregularities in the petition's original filing that she had identified in her review. She filed it electronically before I left the building. The court granted the motion the following morning. The preliminary hearing was rescheduled to July 15th, 2025. I had time. Not enough of what I needed and not everything in place, but time. A conservatorship petition before a probate judge is not resolved through good intentions. It is a documentation problem. Nathan had spent 7 months building documentation. What I had was a notebook, a camera running inside Eleanor's clock, and a woman who had spent 30 years following money through the most difficult channels it travels. It was not yet enough to walk into that courtroom on July 15th. But there was something I had not yet found, something that had been sitting 12 feet from where I slept every night, in a drawer in Nathan's study that he had in recent weeks stopped being careful about. Before I show you what was inside that drawer, and I promise it changes everything, leave the word fire in the comments. If you've come this far, you've earned what comes next. Note some elements of this story are fictionalized for storytelling and educational purposes. If you'd prefer to step away before this part, that's completely understood. The first Saturday Nathan left for a morning property showing without stopping to check on me was May 3rd. Vivian had come home from her overnight shift at 7 and gone directly to bed. I waited 20 minutes after the house went quiet. Then I walked to the study. I moved through the room the way 22 years of financial investigation work had trained me to move through any space where I was looking for something methodically, without urgency, touching nothing that didn't need to be touched, replacing everything exactly as I found it. The objective is never to take anything, it is to leave no evidence that a search occurred. You need the subject to believe he is still the only person who knows what is in that room. The top drawer, a legal pad, 2 pens, a folder of utility receipts going back to January. I looked through the folder, item by item. Nothing there. The second drawer. Inside a manila folder containing account documents, I partially recognized. The first pages were financial instruments Maggie had identified in her report credit accounts opened under my name. I lifted the folder carefully face down, preserving its orientation, and set it beside the drawer. Beneath it was a commercial-sized envelope opened along the top, addressed to me at my previous address, 1142 Sycamore Ridge Road, with a Keystone Home Insurance return address in the upper left corner. The postmark read, October 2024. I had been living in this house since the previous July. I had never seen this envelope before. 6 pages inside. Preliminary Fire Investigation Report. Covered property 1142 Sycamore Ridge Road. Date of loss July 18th, 2024. I read it from the beginning. Point of origin. Lower storage area basement. Note: examination of basement electrical panel and wiring systems revealed no evidence of fault overload or damage consistent with accidental ignition. Cause: undetermined pending further investigation. File status open pending unit review. Anticipated follow-up timeline Q1 2025. I knew that basement. I had built the storage shelving myself 3 years after we bought the property using reclaimed lumber from a derelict barn on the eastern edge of the lot. I had measured and leveled every shelf. I knew the way the space ran the cool corner in the lower left, where Eleanor had wanted the fireproof safe installed because it was the most thermally stable position in a basement that warmed unevenly in summer. The deed documents were in that safe. Eleanor's notarized will was in that safe. Her annotated copy of the tenancy in common arrangement, the one she had paid 2 attorneys to verify, the one that required both sons to agree before any sale could proceed, was in that safe. I had told Nathan what was in it 2 weeks after Eleanor's funeral during a conversation about ensuring important documents were properly accounted for during the estate process. Nathan had listened with the focused, composed attention of a man who was not going to forget what he was being told. Nathan had received this report in October 2024, 3 months after moving me into his house. At no point during the 10 months that followed had he mentioned the report's existence. The open investigation, the pending follow-up, or the preliminary finding that the fire had originated in the basement without identifiable electrical cause. He had put the envelope beneath a folder of financial documents in the second drawer of his desk. I photographed every page. I held each sheet flat against the desk surface with one hand and kept the tablet steady with the other. 6 pages, 6 photographs. I checked each image for legibility before moving to the next. Then I reassembled the envelope, precisely pages in original order, the fold at the same angle. The envelope back beneath the folder at the same depth, the folder returned to the position I had found it. I closed the drawer. I walked back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. There is a moment in every financial investigation when the components you have been building separately over weeks or months align into a single visible shape. You do not assemble them, they settle together once you have enough of them, the way physical objects settle when you stop applying force. I had spent 7 months building 6 separate components. Sitting on the edge of that bed, I saw the shape they made. I opened the tablet and typed a message to Calvin on the encrypted channel. Found the insurance report. Fire origin basement. No electrical fault, cause listed undetermined. Investigation still open. Conservatorship hearing postponed to July 15th. We move everything now. His reply came 4 minutes later. I have what we need from the recordings. Meet Thursday. I set the tablet on the mattress beside me. Through the guest room window, May light came in flat and steady across the floor. The house was quiet around me, Vivian asleep upstairs. Nathan across town in someone else's property, the study down the hall exactly as I had found it. I let one full breath out, not for anyone, just the breath of a man sitting alone in a room in the morning, in possession for the first time since July of the complete shape of what had been done to him. Money can be recovered by court order. Debt can be legally discharged. But a fire, if it was what this report strongly suggested, elevated everything that came after it into a different category of crime. Nathan had not simply exploited my displacement. He had arranged it. He had stood in that driveway 42 minutes after the first engine arrived, in a clean shirt with clear eyes, and said every correct word in the correct order, 1 beat too late. Eleanor's clock had been listening to him in that study for 11 weeks. By Thursday, I would know exactly what it had heard. I texted Calvin the same afternoon I found the report. We met 2 days later, same parking lot, same truck, and without preamble, he pulled a small device from the center console and pressed play. The truck cab was the same as it had been in February, warm, close. The smell of old coffee and the particular silence of 2 people who have done serious work together and don't need to fill the air between important things. Calvin set the device on the console between us, angled toward me, and watched the middle distance through the windshield while I listened. The recording was 47 seconds. Nathan's voice, February 14th, 3 weeks after the clock had gone back up on the study wall. He was on the phone. The ambient quality of the audio was exactly what you get from a recessed device placed behind a clock, casing 12 feet from a desk chair, clear enough for transcription, close enough for voice identification. The conservatorship petition has been filed. The deed transfer is contingent on the medical file clearing judicial review. Veld is still patient. I've told him the authorization paperwork is a probate formality. He doesn't know that what he's already signed is not a legally valid power of attorney. Once the judge rules on the guardianship, my father's ability to contest any transaction ends. Whatever he thinks he's doing with the orchard, it becomes legally irrelevant. 47 seconds. I asked Calvin to play it again. He pressed the button without comment. I listened a second time with the specific focus of someone committing language to memory rather than simply processing it, each word, each phrase in sequence, the tone of a man who had decided something a long time ago and had been executing it with patience since. That's enough, I said. Calvin put the device away. The man sitting in the back seat was someone I had known intermittently for 20 years. Joe Whitfield, retired fraud investigator. 2 decades working financial crimes, had the particular physical stillness of a person who has spent a career listening to things that other people talk over. We had worked near each other on a case in 2003 that neither of us discussed in general company. He reached across the seat and shook my hand once. He said 3 words. I said 3 back. That was sufficient between people who have worked difficult problems in the real world, where trust is established by history rather than by explicit declaration. Calvin laid out the remaining structure in plain, operational language. The appointment at Mill Haven Savings and Trust would be made in my name, for the purpose of establishing a living trust for the Hargrove Orchard on County Road 7. A living trust, unlike a standard deed arrangement, places an asset under permanent protective management terms that no court-appointed conservator, no unauthorized power of attorney, and no third-party transaction can override without the explicit consent of the trustee. If the living trust was executed legally and filed before July 15th, Nathan's conservatorship petition became procedurally worthless. The orchard would be untouchable by any instrument Nathan had built over the preceding 10 months. Nathan could not allow the appointment to proceed. Calvin and I had agreed on this in the abstract in February, and the 47 seconds I had just listened to confirmed it with precision. The moment Nathan understood what I was doing at that bank, he would move to stop it. Mill Haven Savings and Trust had 6 HD cameras in the main lobby, one above each teller window in the upper corners, positioned to cover every square foot of the floor. Calvin would be at window 3 as a non-customer. Joe would be near the entrance, monitoring the exterior approach. The bank would provide the documentation we could not manufacture ourselves. On June 2nd, on a Monday evening, I stood in Nathan's kitchen and made the call. The study door was open 4 inches enough. I had confirmed it was open by walking past twice in the preceding hour without altering it. Nathan's voice had been audible from that room for the past 20 minutes, which meant he was at his desk. I dialed Mill Haven Savings and Trust from the kitchen phone. I kept my voice at the volume I would use for any ordinary errand call, not raised, not performing, just the appropriate level for a man standing in a kitchen making an appointment. Mill Haven Savings and Trust, I'd like to schedule an appointment for Wednesday morning if you have availability. I'm looking to establish a living trust for a property, the Hargrove Orchard on County Road 7. A brief exchange with the scheduling assistant. 9:30 would be fine. I wrote nothing down. I thanked her and ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and walked through to the living room. I did not look toward the study doorway as I passed it. From the tablet, I sent a message to Connor. Wednesday, June 11th, stand by. No need to fly yet. His reply came in 90 seconds. I have a bag packed. I'll be on the first flight if you need me. Don't wait until it's too late to ask. I read it twice. Then I put the tablet away and went to bed at a reasonable hour because a man who cannot sleep the night before a planned confrontation has not done enough of the preceding work. I had not looked toward the study when I walked past the open door. But in the 30 seconds after I set down the phone, the kitchen had the specific quality of a space where someone has just understood that the situation they believed they were managing has completely changed shape. I had 9 days. Nathan had 9 days. What each of us chose to do with those 9 days would determine what the rest of my life looked like. And so on a Wednesday morning in June, 9 days after the call that Nathan had heard through the open door of his study, I drove to Mill Haven Savings and Trust for the appointment I described to you from the floor. The marble was cold through the back of my jacket. The fluorescent lights above were doing what fluorescent lights do in institutional spaces. I had been on that floor for 11 seconds when the man from window 3 stepped out of the teller line. Calvin Reed did not move quickly. He moved in the deliberate, unrushed manner of a man who has spent 19 years in law enforcement and knows that speed is what happens when you haven't prepared. He covered the lobby in 8 steps and positioned himself between Nathan and the counter without touching either. He held up a card his retired county sheriff identification laminated in the front flap of his wallet, where it had lived for 6 years, at a height Nathan could read without straining. Not a threat. A presence. The specific presence of a man who has legal authority in his history, even when he no longer carries it by title. Joe Whitfield had already folded his home equity brochure and moved to the glass entrance doors. He stood there with his hands at his sides in the manner of someone whose job in the next several minutes was simply to occupy a position in space and not leave it. 3 bank employees had their hands on their phones or had already dialed. The manager, a woman in her 40s, with the composed efficiency of someone who has been trained for exactly this kind of morning, crossed the floor to where I was and asked if I could stand. I told her my left wrist had come down wrong and my right elbow was sore, but that standing was fine. She brought a chair from behind the counter and positioned it near the 4th window and suggested I sit. Nathan had not stopped talking. He had shifted from the register he had used at the table-controlled clinical, the language of a concerned son, into something faster and less managed. He doesn't understand what he's doing here. He gets confused about appointments. He's been having episodes, there's a medical evaluation on file. He had turned to address Calvin without fully understanding who Calvin was. Calvin had not responded. He stood in the same position and watched Nathan the way you watch a situation you are not going to intervene in until intervention is specifically required. The first officer arrived 6 minutes after the employees called. His partner came in 40 seconds behind him. They were young, mid-20s, and they walked into the lobby the way young officers walk into a situation that has not yet been fully explained to them, with alertness and without a working theory. I was sitting in the chair the bank manager had brought me, holding a makeshift ice pack she had improvised from a plastic bag and ice from the break room, and I waited until the first officer reached me before I began. I spoke for 11 minutes. I did not repeat myself. I told him about the conservatorship petition Nathan had filed at the probate court 6 weeks earlier, citing a cognitive assessment authored by a physician, Dr. Raymond Goss, Neurology, Hargrove Valley General Hospital, who did not appear in the state's medical licensing registry in any capacity, active or expired. I told him about the address change form signed in August, the Social Security number field that had been partially pre-filled, and the 9 credit accounts and 5 personal loans totaling $148,000 subsequently opened in my name without my knowledge. I cited 3 account numbers from memory, because I had committed them to memory for this purpose. I told him about Raymond Veld and the $55,000 deposit made against a real estate purchase agreement for the Hargrove Orchard, a transaction predicated on a power of attorney that had never been legally executed and was not valid under Ohio law. I explained that Nathan had represented this document to Veld as a standard probate authorization, which was not what it was, and that Veld's deposit had been accepted against a transaction Nathan had no legal authority to complete. I told him about the fire at 1142 Sycamore Ridge Road, July 18, 2024, and the preliminary insurance investigation report that had identified the basement as the point of origin with no evidence of accidental ignition, a report that Nathan had received in October of 2024 and had not disclosed to me. The officer took careful notes throughout. He asked 3 clarifying questions, one about the conservatorship filing date, one about the credit bureau that had first returned the anomalous report, one to confirm the spelling of the investor's surname. He did not ask me to slow down or repeat myself. He listened to me the way people listen to someone who is not performing urgency, not managing an emotion, not trying to convince them of anything except the sequence of events. Just facts in order from a man who had spent 22 years learning how to give them that way. Through the lobby's front windows, I could see Nathan on the sidewalk with the second officer. Nathan was still talking, explaining, qualifying, gesturing with one hand in the particular motion of a man constructing a framework in real time. The second officer had closed his notepad. I signed the statement the first officer produced. The bank manager asked if I needed any further assistance, and I thanked her and said no. I walked across the marble floor and out through the glass doors into the June morning light. I did not look at Nathan as I passed. I found my car in the lot and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. The bank's glass facade reflected the sky and the street and everything on it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I started the car. The police report was the formal beginning, not the conclusion. The recordings from the clock, the financial documentation Maggie had compiled across 4 months. The insurance investigation still open at the county level, those were the materials that would make the beginning hold. And there was still one variable I had never been able to fully account for. The only piece of the structure I had been unable to verify, because it was not a document, and not a recording, and not a number that Maggie could trace through a federal database. I drove home knowing that every piece I had spent 5 months building was now in motion, and that the only thing I could not plan for the only genuine unknown remaining was what Vivian would do when she understood completely what she had been part of. I had a best estimate. I had always had a best estimate. I had also spent 22 years learning that best estimates are not evidence, and that relying on them before the moment of confirmation is how good cases come apart in the final hour. Nathan's car turned into the driveway at 6:10 that evening. I heard the engine cut, and then there were 45 seconds of nothing before the front door opened. 45 seconds is not a man gathering his briefcase from the passenger seat. It is a man sitting in a parked car in his own driveway, working out the opening lines of his next conversation. He came in with a clean shirt. He had stopped somewhere before coming home changed, or at minimum straightened. The composure had nearly returned. His shoulders were set, his expression arranged. The specific readiness of a man who has decided that the problem is manageable if he gets the framing right. He set his keys on the hook by the door, the same hook, the same deliberate motion as every other evening in this house. Then he came into the living room. Vivian was in the kitchen doorway behind him, still in her hospital scrubs. She had come home during the afternoon, which I had not expected. Nathan began with the register I recognized from the dinner table conversation in September, the measured, reasonable voice of a man who is positioning himself as the person with access to the complete picture. What had happened at the bank was a misunderstanding. Thomas had been operating on information provided by people who did not have the full context. The conservatorship evaluation was something Nathan had pursued out of genuine concern, not malice. He had perhaps gone about it imperfectly. Things could be explained if Thomas would allow him to explain them. He spoke for about 2 minutes. He was fluent, and he was not incorrect in his grammar. What he lacked was anywhere specific to put his eyes when he was talking, which is what happens to a man whose narrative has run ahead of the evidence that was supposed to support it. "I want you to hear something," I said. Nathan stopped. His eyes moved to the side table. The playback device was sitting in the center of it. A small black rectangle, unremarkable, the kind of thing that looks like a remote control or a wireless speaker and does not announce what it is. Nathan looked at it. Then he looked at me. His mouth closed with the specific, unhurried closing of a man who has just recognized something that requires him to recalculate everything he was about to say. I pressed play. The recording had the ambient quality of audio captured from a stationary device placed inside a clock, casing 12 feet from a desk, clear enough for every word, present enough in the room's acoustics to be immediately identifiable as a real environment rather than a studio. No soundtrack, no narration. Just Nathan's voice from the 14th of February, in a room he had believed was entirely private. "The conservatorship petition has been filed. The deed transfer is contingent on the medical file clearing judicial review. Veld is still patient. I've told him the authorization paperwork is a probate formality. He doesn't know that what he's already signed is not a legally valid power of attorney. Once the judge rules on the guardianship, my father's ability to contest any transaction ends." 47 seconds. The room held the silence after it, the way a room holds the sound after a door closes. Vivian had not moved from the kitchen doorway. She was still in her scrubs, one hand resting against the doorframe. Her face had gone very still, not the stillness of shock, which tends to be active and searching, but the deeper stillness of a person in the process of reorganizing everything around a piece of information that will not rearrange itself to fit what they already knew. Nathan opened his mouth. That's taken completely out of context. If you understood what the situation actually... Where did the $55,000 go, Nathan? Vivian's voice was very quiet. Not angry. The question of a woman who already has a strong hypothesis and is asking because she wants to see what the answer looks like when it comes out in real time. Nathan turned to look at his wife. I watched what happened to his face in the next 2 seconds, the jaw tightening at the hinge, the specific flatness that comes over a person's expression when they are searching with real urgency for the opening line of a sentence they have not prepared. He had spent 10 months preparing for a conversation with me. He had not prepared for her to be a participant. I stood up. I'll be in my room, I said. I said it to neither of them in particular. I picked up the playback device and walked toward the hallway. In the doorway, I stopped. Vivian? I said it without turning back into the room. If you want to talk to someone, Maggie Calloway's number is in the tablet on the side table. She'll answer. I went into the guest room and closed the door. I sat down on the floor with my back against it, the way I had in November when I locked it against the part of myself that wanted to confront Nathan before I was ready. This time I sat against it, because the conversation on the other side of it was not mine to be part of anymore. Nathan's voice came through the wall low and then lower. And then, the particular urgent quality that a persuasive person's voice takes when the person they are trying to persuade has stopped responding. He was building a framework in real time. He had been building frameworks for this man's entire adult life, and he was very good at it. Vivian's responses became less frequent. Then there were none. She was sitting with something in the way people sit with things that have settled permanently, that will not be talked back into uncertainty by a fluent and patient voice. Then silence on both sides. Then a sound I recognized, the tablet on the side table being lifted. A brief pause. A number being dialed. And then Vivian's voice, clear, steady from the other side of the wall. Maggie, this is Vivian. I need to talk to you. I sat against the door in the dark and let out one quiet breath. In 22 years of building cases, the variable you cannot plan for almost never destroys the outcome. Sometimes it is the thing that holds everything together. Maggie arrived at 7:30 the next morning with 2 cups of coffee, and the specific expression I remembered from 22 years of working the same kinds of cases, the face of a former lead investigator who has found the piece that makes the entire picture cohere. Nathan was already gone. He had left sometime after midnight, and he had not left a note. I knew that expression. I had seen it at the end of difficult cases when the last document came through, and the fraud's architecture became fully visible all at once. Maggie never dramatized those moments. She simply arrived with the materials and presented them in sequence, which was worth more than any dramatic announcement. Vivian had opened the door for her. When I came downstairs, the 2 of them were already at the kitchen table, Maggie with a folder open in front of her. Vivian with both hands around a cup she was not drinking from. The morning light came in flat and ordinary through the window above the sink, the same window Eleanor had looked out of in the kitchen on Sycamore Ridge. It was the kind of light that makes no allowances for what is happening beneath it. Maggie opened with the business file. 3 years earlier, Nathan had transferred $340,000 from client escrow accounts held by his real estate brokerage to a private investment vehicle, a closed real estate fund whose principals had approached him with projected returns that did not survive contact with the actual market. Client escrow accounts in real estate are not Nathan's money. They are funds held in legal trust on behalf of buyers and sellers during transaction closings. Moving them into an outside investment is not a gray area. It is a federal crime. The fund had failed in 8 months. Every dollar Nathan transferred had been lost. Since then, he had constructed a slow-motion cover. Each major transaction his brokerage handled produced commission revenue, and a portion of each commission had been quietly redirected to replenish the escrow accounts before they were examined too closely. It was the financial equivalent of a man who has made a hole in a wall and is covering it with increasingly elaborate wallpaper, effective temporarily, as long as no one takes the wallpaper down. The wallpaper was coming down. A routine regulatory compliance audit of Nathan's firm had been scheduled for the fourth quarter of 2025. Compliance audits in real estate brokerage examine escrow account activity in detail. Transaction ledgers, transfer authorizations, account balances at the time of the relevant closings. If the auditors ran the correct queries against the correct date range, they would find the gap. $340,000 moved without authorization, from money that did not belong to Nathan into an investment that no longer existed. The penalty for that finding under federal statutes governing financial fraud and fiduciary breach is not a civil fine. It is a prison sentence. Nathan needed $480,000, the projected Veld sale price for the Hargrove Orchard, deposited into the right accounts before the Q4 audit began. Not to fund a lifestyle, to fill a hole large enough to end his career and his freedom if it was ever openly examined. The $67,000 in hidden credit card debt, payments to a private creditor who had independently identified irregularities in Nathan's transaction history and was accepting monthly installments in exchange for not formalizing what he knew. Maggie set the last page down. He wasn't trying to put his father in a memory care facility because he was greedy. He was trying to prevent a federal indictment. The kitchen was quiet. I waited a moment. Then I said, "Vivian, I need to tell you something about the medication." I described the Sunday in August or September of 2024, the pill organizer, the lisinopril tablet that was fractionally lighter than 7 years of holding the same tablet had taught my hand to expect. The color slightly less chalky. I told her about holding it up to the bathroom light for 4 seconds, about flushing it, about taking the real medication from the interior lining of my travel bag, where it had been every Sunday, after that substitute down-the-drain real pill from the backup bottle, the same routine for 9 months. I told her about the dinner that evening, the pause before answering Nathan's question about the weather forecast. The 2-second drift that I had introduced deliberately had watched Nathan notice, had watched him file as evidence for the story he was building. That the performance, every hesitation, every repeated question at dinner, every moment of apparent confusion I had produced in that house, had been constructed by me from that first Sunday onward, with the specific intention of giving Nathan exactly what he was looking for and nothing that was real. Vivian did not move while I was talking. She had the particular stillness of a person absorbing information that is reorganizing itself into a shape she cannot push back into ambiguity. She was a registered nurse with 12 years of clinical experience. She understood from the inside what had been done to her with professional precision. She had spent 9 months observing what she had been told was cognitive deterioration. She had reported those observations to her husband. She had attributed to genuine decline specific behavioral episodes that I had constructed and calibrated to match the symptom profile Nathan had described to the physician, whose name did not appear in any licensing registry. She had signed a clinical witness record, attesting to the authenticity of things that had never occurred. She had been used as an instrument of accuracy in a crime committed against the man sitting across the table from her. He was going to put his own father-in-law in a memory care facility, she said. Not to me. To the empty chair where Nathan had sat. "Do you have copies of anything you signed, Vivian?" She looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then she stood, went upstairs, and came back carrying a shoebox. She set it on the table. "When you're a nurse, you keep copies of what you sign. I learned that in my first year on the ward. I didn't know what half of these were being used for, but I kept them. Inside, 31 documents, organized chronologically, paper-clipped by month. Patient observation records, each one bearing her professional signature and registration number. Correspondence drafted in language that assumed the existence of a power of attorney Nathan had never legally obtained. A draft version of the conservatorship petition listing Vivian as a co-petitioner in a version she had never been shown and had never agreed to. Maggie began placing them on the table one at a time from left to right, in the order a federal investigator would want to examine them. I looked at Vivian across that table and understood something Nathan had miscalculated entirely. He had given her exactly enough access to be useful, and had trusted that it was not enough to make her dangerous to him. He was wrong about the second part. I pulled out the prepaid tablet and typed one line to Connor. "Get on a plane. It's time." Connor landed at 9:34 and was at Nathan's front door 16 minutes later, which told me he had been at the airport when I texted him last night. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked older than I had expected, which is what 11 months of distance and worry does to a person's face even when they are in their mid-30s. We stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he stepped inside, and we held each other, the particular long kind of embrace that doesn't need any language to justify its length. He had driven straight from the terminal. He smelled like a plane. When we separated, he looked at my left wrist where the brace was still on from the bank counter. "I'm all right," I said. "I know you are," he said. He said it in the same tone he had used at 7 years old when he was trying not to cry and too proud to let anyone mention it. Connor turned and saw Vivian standing at the kitchen entrance. She had changed out of her scrubs and was holding a cup she was not drinking from, the same way she had been holding one when I came downstairs that morning. She and my son looked at each other across the room. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it simply, without qualification or preamble, not the apology of someone who has rehearsed it, but of someone who recognizes that the word is the only one that applies, and that adding more words to it would reduce its accuracy. "I know," Connor said. He meant it the same way. Maggie had spent the morning organizing. By the time Connor arrived, she had the materials arranged into 2 manila folders and a thick accordion file, each section ordered and labeled. Each piece of evidence dated and cross-referenced in the way she had prepared case materials for 22 years. She was standing at the kitchen counter with a legal pad and 3 completed pages of notes, which was Maggie indicating, without stating it out loud, that she was ready to go. We drove to the Mill Haven Police Department on Cedar Road in Connor's rental car. The 4 of us made the drive with very little conversation, which was not tension. It was 4 people consolidating themselves before a formal proceeding. Detective Sandra Okafor's office was on the 2nd floor down a hallway, where the linoleum had been replaced recently, and nothing else had. Her office was small and clean, with 2 small cacti on the windowsill that had been there long enough to need new soil and a framed investigator's certification on the wall behind her desk. She shook hands with each of us as we came in, said nothing about the number of people, and arranged 2 extra chairs from the hallway without asking anyone to help her. She sat. She folded her hands on the desk. She looked at me and said, "Whenever you're ready." I had given testimony and formal statements more times across 22 years than I could conveniently count. What I had never done was sit on this side of the desk and give one for myself. I found the experience clarifying in a way I had not anticipated. I presented the material in the order it had occurred: the address form in August, the credit accounts, the phone redirection, the mail interceptions, the power of attorney proposal, the fabricated cognitive assessment, the probate court filing the 47-second recording from Eleanor's clock, and the insurance investigation report. When I reached each piece, Maggie placed the corresponding document on the desk without comment. Okafor listened to all of it without writing anything down. She watched me the way experienced investigators watch a witness, not summarizing as they go, but absorbing the whole shape of it before committing to paper. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one question. "Who is Raymond Veld?" I explained. She listened to the explanation the same way she had listened to everything else. "Mr. Veld filed a fraud complaint with the county 3 weeks ago," she said. We have an open file. I've been waiting on records from the county auditor before moving forward on it. She made a note, the first one she had made in the session. This connects them. She picked up the insurance report and read it. She read it again. She set it on the desk and did not put anything on top of it. This investigation was not closed. It was left in the structural fire backlog when the primary investigator transferred units. No one followed up on the preliminary. She picked up her desk phone. I'm escalating this today. She placed a call while we sat in the office and said 4 short, factual sentences to whoever answered, then ended the call and set the phone down. The fire marshal's office will reopen the investigation formally within 48 hours. We gave our formal statements in sequence. I went first, then Maggie with her documentation, then Vivian with the shoebox. Connor gave a brief, corroborating statement regarding the messages Nathan had sent him in October, claiming I was in therapy and unavailable. The 4 statements together produced a record that covered 10 months of documented conduct from 4 independent witnesses who had never been in the same room for any of it. Okafor thanked us at 4:15 and said a detective from financial crimes would be in contact by the end of the week. We were in the car at 4:40. Connor drove. The June light had gone flat and golden in the way of early evenings in Ohio in summer, laying across the road in long, low bands. At 6:09 my phone rang. Calvin's number. They picked him up 20 minutes ago. Motel on Route 9 out past the county line. I told the car. Connor's hands stayed where they were on the wheel. Maggie looked out the passenger window. Vivian in the back seat beside me put her hand flat on the seat between us and did not say anything. No one said anything for a while. I reached into my jacket pocket. The key was there, the small flat key to the fireproof safe, on the same ring it had been on since the night I carried that safe through the front door, with my house burning behind me the previous July. I had not put it down once in the months between. Connor drove us back through Millhaven, past the pharmacy, past the hardware store parking lot, where Calvin and I had met, past the narrow storefront of the watchmaker on 5th Street. The town looked the same as it had always looked. I was the person who had changed. In the safe, there was Eleanor's notarized will, and a letter she had written to Connor in her own hand, sealed, that he had never seen. We were going to open it tonight. That evening, Connor and I sat at the kitchen table long after Maggie had driven home, and Vivian had gone upstairs, and for the first time since the night of the fire, I brought the fireproof safe up from the bedroom closet. It was heavier than I remembered, or I was more tired than I had been the last time I carried it. The corner was still dented from the night I had come through the smoke at 1142 Sycamore Ridge Road, a small deformation in the steel casing, not structural, just a record of the speed with which I had moved. I had never thought to have it repaired. Some things are more accurate with their damage left visible. I turned the key. The seal broke with the particular release of a space that has been closed for a long time. Inside Eleanor's official will, 6 typed and notarized pages with 2 witness signatures folded along their original creases. And beneath the will, a personal envelope, standard white, sealed with interior tape and labeled in her handwriting, for Thomas. When you're ready. I passed the will to Connor first. He read it the way he read things that mattered, slowly, and without moving, working his way through each clause before proceeding to the next. When he reached the property schedule and the tenancy and common structure, he stopped. He went back and read it a second time. Then he set the pages flat on the table. She owned 50%, he said. And she structured it so that her 50% would pass to Nathan and me, jointly requiring both of our written consents before any sale or transfer could go through. Neither of us could act without the other. That's right. Connor was quiet for a moment. He was working through the geometry of it, the same geometry I had worked through in the probate attorney's office, and before that, at the kitchen counter on County Road 7, And before that, in the years I had watched Eleanor draft and revise until she was satisfied with the precision of every clause. Nathan could never have completed the sale. Even with a conservatorship over you, he still needed my signature on my mother's half. He could not have obtained that signature without me knowing what was happening. So he needed to eliminate your ability to object before any of it could reach me. He looked at me across the table. He needed the conservatorship to come first, to close that door before anyone thought to ask me. Yes, she built that clause deliberately. Not a question. She saw things clearly, I said. She always did. From the beginning. Connor was quiet again for a moment. Then he nodded once in the way of a man confirming something he has needed a long time to confirm. He straightened the pages and set them to one side. I picked up the personal envelope. I broke the tape along the seal and removed 3 pages of notepaper in Eleanor's handwriting, dense, careful lines in the blue ink she had always used. I read it aloud, which was what felt right and what I believed she would have preferred. She did not name any fears. She did not address anyone except me. What she wrote about was 3 specific harvests she carried particularly clearly: the Cortland year when the entire crop came in 2 weeks early and we ate more apples than we sold; the autumn of 2009 when Connor was 12 and helped with the picking for the first time. And Eleanor said he had his grandfather's hands; and the last good harvest before her diagnosis, which she described in careful, loving detail, as though she was certain someone would want to know exactly how it had felt to be there on those mornings. She wrote about wanting both sons to have some reason, after she was gone, to talk to each other. She wrote that she trusted me to understand what the orchard was and what it wasn't, and that she had arranged things accordingly. The last 2 lines in her handwriting were these: "Take care of the orchard, Thomas. Take care of each other." That's the whole of it. Connor folded the letter along its original creases and placed it on the table beside the will. Neither of us said anything for several minutes. The kitchen was quiet in the way of a room that has just received something it will hold for a long time. The summer and autumn moved in the way of seasons that contain a great deal of consequential activity and very little that is suitable for narration. Vivian cooperated fully with the federal investigation, providing documentation and testimony over a period of 6 weeks. She was offered conditional immunity in exchange for her complete cooperation and accepted it in July. She moved out of Millhaven in August to a town I did not ask the name of. Nathan's case moved through the federal system. A multi-count fraud and elder abuse matter of this complexity requires careful pre-sentencing preparation, and the sentencing hearing was scheduled for the spring of 2026. The arson investigation ran as a parallel proceeding. I declined to attend any of the hearings. In October, Connor flew back to Millhaven, and we drove to the county planning office together on a Tuesday afternoon. We filed the application with the Ohio Agricultural Land Preservation Program to place the orchard under a conservation easement. The easement covered the 75% of the orchard that Connor and I controlled between us, my original 50%, and Connor's 25% share of Eleanor's estate. Under the terms of the easement, the land could be farmed, inherited, walked through, and lived beside in perpetuity. It could not be subdivided, developed, sold to a commercial developer, or monetized outside of agricultural use. Whatever value Hargrove Valley Development Group had assigned to its development potential was now a legal irrelevance. A notary witnessed my signature. The county clerk stamped the document without ceremony. I drove home the long way through the orchard road past the rows of bare November trees. On the 14th of December, Connor and I walked the orchard at first light, the first morning of the month those trees officially stood on permanently protected land. The ground was frozen. The Honeycrisps and the Jonah Golds and the Cortlands were bare, their branches reaching up into a gray Ohio sky, in the way of trees that know to wait. Near the north fence I stopped. A garden stake driven deep, the kind Eleanor had used throughout the orchard to mark the young trees in their first years. The paint had nearly all gone, but the writing was still clear. In the permanent marker she had always used for things she wanted to last, Honeycrisp planted spring 2019. I crouched down and put my hand on the stake. The cedar was cold and smooth under my palm. The tree above it was bare, but rooted its root system going down into the frozen ground, 3 times the depth of what was visible above it. As Eleanor had once explained to me with the patience of someone who found it important, that I understand how trees actually work. Connor stood beside me. He didn't say anything. I stayed there a moment. Then I stood up and looked down the long rows, bare branches, frozen earth, the whole orchard resting before whatever came next. The light was gray and clean, and it made everything look exactly as permanent as it was. Spring, I said quietly. Not to Connor. Connor did not ask who I was talking to. I have spent my entire working life asking what truly happened, sitting with answers that were worse than the questions, and learning to carry them forward regardless. I have come to believe this. The truth is almost never the hardest part. The hardest part is deciding once you have it what you do next. My son tried to erase me. He came closer than I prefer to acknowledge. But there is something about a man who has spent his whole life refusing to look away from difficult things that makes him very hard to make disappear. And standing at the edge of Eleanor's orchard in the frozen air of December 2025, I thought she would find that funny. She always did love a stubborn man. If you've stayed to the end of this family story, you now know more about my year than most people who share my name. I am a man of discipline. I believe God gives us the people we love for less time than we are ever ready to lose them, and that what remains belongs to us to use correctly. Eleanor understood that long before I did. Here is what I would tell you. Plainly, do not wait the way I waited. If something is wrong in your family story, say it early. Ask for help before the silence becomes strategy. I spent 11 months alone with something I did not have to carry alone. The people who came when I finally asked deserved to be asked sooner. My view simply love and trust are not the same thing. And trust is not the same as blindness. You can love someone fully and still hold them accountable for what they chose to do. These grandpa stories, the difficult ones, the ones that cost something to tell, are the only kind I know how to offer honestly. Each of these grandpa stories begins from the same conviction. A family story told honestly without softening its edges is worth more than a comfortable version of it. This is what grandpa stories are for. If this reached you, leave a word in the comments, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe if you want to be here when the next story begins. Thank you for watching to the end. It means something. A note: the stories ahead contain fictionalized elements built for storytelling and reflection. If that isn't for you, there is no judgment in choosing something else, and always an open door if you return.